Have you ever woken up next to a person you no longer recognize? The face is the same, the hands are unchanged, but the gaze is distant, as if over time, an invisible barrier has arisen between you. As if the tenderness that once lingered in gestures and words now exists only as a memory. Time has passed. The children have grown up, responsibilities have lessened, and amidst the silence of routine, an uncomfortable truth emerges, one that's hard to name. Many women stop loving their husbands over the years. It happens quietly, no announcements, no exact date. It happens slowly, like a wall cracking from the inside, never fully breaking apart. They stay, but not out of love, perhaps out of habit, fear, convenience, or guilt. But something vital is lost, and the most terrifying thing is they don't always know what led to this loss. This is what we'll discuss, about what Freud called the return of the repressed, about emotions suppressed over decades, about gestures never acknowledged, and desires that don't die but transform. Because Freud didn't offer ready-made advice, he asked difficult questions. And in this video, we'll ask these questions fearlessly. Why do so many women begin to feel disgust, boredom, or even contempt toward their partners as they age? Is it just a hormonal issue, or is it an emotional reckoning that comes too late? Freud dedicated his life to listening, and what he heard in his offices, in the silence, were stories like these, women who spent decades caring for everyone and everything except themselves. Women who endured emotional absence, swallowed words, ceased to exist to maintain order in the home. But the body remembers, the mind remembers. The unconscious, as Freud said, doesn't forget. And one day, when the noise of life quiets down, it begins to speak. That's why this change is often invisible from the outside. To the world, the couple remains together, but inside, something has already died. It's not hatred. It's not a recent resentment. It's psychic exhaustion, an accumulation of unspoken disappointments. It's the late awakening of a woman who begins to see herself with different eyes and, seeing herself, dislikes what she sees beside her. And it's not just about guilt. Psychoanalysis isn't for judging someone, but for understanding what lies behind feelings that arise without rational explanation. Many of these women don't know why they stopped loving. They only know they can no longer tolerate the constant presence of the other person, that the man who once embodied safety and loyalty now feels like a burden. And it hurts because acknowledging this distance means admitting the years weren't as they dreamed. It means acknowledging loneliness within a shared life. Freud taught us that love isn't eternal by nature. It needs to be nourished, questioned, transformed. What isn't renewed stagnates, and what stagnates sickens. A marriage built on promises and expectations ages with the bodies, but doesn't always mature with the souls. In this video, we'll delve into the psychological, emotional, and symbolic reasons explaining why so many women cease to love their husbands over time. We'll talk about the fatigue of repetition, the suppression of femininity, emotional absence, mourning for desire, and the awakening of a new identity. Not to destroy love, but to understand it more truthfully. If you've ever felt this discomfort, if you've ever looked at your partner and thought, I don't love him anymore, but don't know why this video is for you. It doesn't offer magical answers, but it poses deep questions, because sometimes all we need is a mirror. And Freud, with all his contradictions, remains one of the most powerful mirrors ever held up to the human psyche. Freud said repetition is one of the unconscious's most powerful mechanisms. We repeat what we know because it gives us a sense of control. Predictability reduces anxiety. At the start of a relationship, this repetition creates bonds. Shared habits, morning coffee together, evening routines, familiar gestures are symbolic forms of intimacy. They create a sense of belonging, stability. But there's a paradox in this comfort. What was once safety can become a prison. And what was a loving routine becomes over time, a closed circle where nothing new blossoms. The same tone of voice, the same type of conversation, the same detached gaze. A woman, living 4 years within this pattern, begins to feel a fatigue that isn't merely physical. It's existential fatigue. She looks at her husband and already knows what he'll say, knows how he'll react to everything, knows what annoys him, what distracts him, what he ignores. And what was once cozy predictability becomes a mirror of stagnation. In this context, the husband becomes a symbol of everything she couldn't be, not through his direct fault, but because he was present, nearby, while she destroyed herself. He embodies the system, the structure, the life she led out of duty, not choice. Every time he sits on the couch while she washes the dishes, every time he speaks without listening, every time he ignores her presence, she unconsciously relives the feeling of invisibility that accompanied her 4 years. This is a resentment sometimes mistaken for lack of love, but it's not that. It's a form of grief, grief for the life she didn't live, for missed opportunities, for suppressed desires, for the self that ceased to exist so others could survive. And this grief gradually turns into alienation, coldness, rejection. Many of these women feel ashamed to admit their feelings. They think they're ungrateful, that they should be happy because they have a family, a husband, a home. But soul suffering isn't resolved by comparisons. It needs to be heard, and most importantly understood. Freud argued that healing begins when the unconscious emerges into the light of consciousness. When a woman recognizes that it's not a lack of love, it's an excess of silence. That it's not contempt, it's a request for space. That it's not rejection, it's an attempt to exist, for the first time, as a whole person. This stifled cry arising in maturity isn't selfishness. It's emotional survival. It's the unconscious demanding rectification. And often, the only way she finds to feel alive again is to leave her husband. Not to hurt him, but to finally reclaim what she lost, the right to be herself. At this stage, the relationship enters a crisis, and the man often doesn't understand what's happening. He sees a distant, bitter, dissatisfied wife, but doesn't realize it didn't start now. It began years ago, when she fell silent, yielded, endured, and he, perhaps unintentionally, didn't notice. What's at stake isn't the end of the marriage, but the birth of a personality. The woman who looks honestly at herself for the first time, who refuses to keep playing a role that makes her sick, and who, upon freeing herself, inevitably changes everything around her, including the marital bond. As Freud said, where I was, their ego shall be, meaning, where there was repression, consciousness must emerge. And this is precisely the process many women undergo in maturity. It's not the end. It's the beginning of something truer, even if it means letting go of everything sustained only by duty. Freud warned us that the unconscious doesn't distinguish past from present as consciousness does. This means we often see in the other not who they are now, but what they represent for our deepest inner structures. This process is called projection. In long-term marriages, these projections gain strength and complexity. Over the years, the husband may cease to be perceived as an emotional partner and unconsciously transform into a father-like figure. Not necessarily the real father, but a symbolic one who demands, judges, imposes. According to Freud, such unconscious substitution is common and often inevitable when childhood experiences remain unprocessed. Many women spent their youth trying to please their father, seeking approval, trying to be good girls. This unmet need can transfer into marriage. Initially, the husband is the object of the desire to be seen, recognized, and loved. But over time, as domestic life settles in, he can occupy the place of an oppressor, often without realizing it. He criticizes, complains, points out shortcomings, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud, expects obedience, demands certain behaviors, insists on routine. And she, without fully understanding why, begins to feel discomfort, watched, confined, as if reliving an old dynamic, the dynamic of a daughter before an unyielding father. The woman begins to stay silent, avoid touch, emotionally withdraw. Desire diminishes, affection becomes an obligation, shared life feels heavy. This movement isn't rational. It's an unconscious choice. Freud argued that erotic desire needs symbolic space. The other must be seen as different, as someone outside the family circle. When the spouse begins to embody the father even, only an unconscious fantasy desire disappears. Libido calls, because we don't desire what we fear, and we don't desire what we confuse with the authority that once imposed limits. Many women can't explain why their husband's touch has become unpleasant, why they prefer to sleep separately, why they no longer want closeness. Desire feeds on novelty. When novelty is absent, it fades. This isn't a moral problem. It's a psychic phenomenon. Freud saw desire as a vital, restless force moving toward what eludes it, toward what hasn't yet been possessed. When everything is scheduled, when there's no room for mystery, desire withers. Love then turns into cohabitation, then habit, and sometimes resistance. The woman asks herself, is this all? This question doesn't stem from ingratitude. It's the result of a soul that spent years trying to fit into an unchanging structure. She doesn't want luxury or a movie romance, she wants life. Inner movement, genuine exchange. But what she gets day after day is the same silence, the same fragmented phrases, the same lack of curiosity. And the cruelest part is that this emotional emptiness is invisible to the outside world. To others, the couple seems stable. No big fights, no drama, but the absence of conflict isn't a sign of peace. It can simply be a symptom of indifference. Routine, meant to be a place of rest, becomes barren soil where nothing grows. Freud saw this as an effect of compulsive repetition, the tendency to repeat old, even painful patterns, hoping for a different outcome. In marriage, this manifests as endless talks, unfulfilled promises, attempts to restore a connection that crumbles at the first misunderstanding. The woman tries to renew the bond. She suggests trips, changes, conversations, but encounters inertia on the other side, and then she tires. This fatigue isn't superficial. It's born from a lack of symbolic renewal. When the couple no longer shares discoveries, no longer surprises each other, no longer looks at each other with curiosity, the relationship begins to fade. Worse still, many women feel guilty about this. They think they're too demanding. But the truth is, the psyche needs activity. It needs emotional stimuli. Over time, this exhaustion turns into distance. The woman falls silent, performs daily tasks, smiles when necessary, but inside, she feels like she's living beside a stranger. There's no more enchantment, no more true presence. Only the repetition of the same thing, as if life is stuck in an unchanging cycle. Freud noted that when desire finds no new paths, it shuts down. It doesn't disappear, it retreats. Often, it's at this moment the woman starts looking beyond the marriage, not necessarily for another man, but for herself, for something that will awaken her, pull her out of the emotional numbness she sank into over years of predictability. Love doesn't die overnight, it dies gradually. Not from a lack of events, but from a lack of living surprises, everyday enchantment, renewal. What depletes the bond isn't time, but the inability to rethink oneself within its framework. And it's at this moment many women, with courage or silence, begin to distance themselves, not out of cruelty, but because they feel nothing anymore toward what never changes. And what doesn't change, as Freud might say, paralyzes the soul. If you enjoy reflections like these, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. For decades, many women followed an invisible script, an unwritten but deeply ingrained role of serving. They cared for children, husbands, homes, worked when necessary, but almost always returned to a second shift housework. Quietly gave up dreams, replacing their own desires with daily duties. Postponed trips, courses, wishes, believing this was the right way. Freud was among the first to give voice to what lay behind seemingly voluntary choices. In his view, repression or suppression doesn't disappear. What is silenced isn't erased. It remains alive in the subconscious, waiting for a breach to burst through. And often, this breach appears in maturity, when children grow up and leave home, when obligations lessen, when external pressure eases. The woman finds herself before a mirror. But looking at herself, she doesn't recognize her reflection. She realizes she got lost among numerous roles. That over many years, she shaped her personality according to others' needs. And now, trying to hear her own voice, she's frightened by what she hears. It's at this moment many women begin to experience something they can't name. Anxiety without clear cause, constant irritation, insomnia, contempt that seems to come from nowhere, especially toward the husband. But as Freud teaches us, this feeling doesn't come from nowhere. It's the return of the repressed. It's the belated manifestation of a desire for freedom suppressed for decades. But deep inside, there's a profound emotional response. The body defends itself against what has symbolically become the embodiment of suppression. And this can happen even if the husband isn't directly authoritarian. Sometimes a passive position, emotional absence, constant expectation of one-sided care is enough. She feels she must care for him as she did for a sick father, or that she must submit as she did in childhood. And in such a situation, desire finds no place to exist. Freud said female desire is deeply marked by symbolic layers. Eroticism, to stay alive, needs clear boundaries. The other must be a partner, not a guardian. He must be a companion, not an authority. When this boundary blurs, the body reacts, and rejection appears as an unconscious attempt to reclaim psychic autonomy. The woman rejecting her husband in this context isn't just refusing physical contact. She's trying to free herself from a role imposed by repetition. She's trying to break with the family history quietly rooted in the marriage. She finally says, no, no to control, no to obedience, no to repeating the plot that makes her a child. This symbolic address is one of the most common, but rarely discussed reasons for a mature couple separating, because it touches deep wounds hard to name. And often, when the woman realizes what happened, she can't go back. The partner's image has been contaminated, and for something new to be born, a significant process of rethinking would be required, something not always possible or desired. What remains is the painful clarity of realizing desire was lost not by chance, but due to symbolic overload, and that perhaps, to regain it, she must first free herself from the image of the father she never wanted to see in her husband, but which, for unconscious reasons, she ultimately projected onto him. Freud, like no other, understood the quiet consequences of self-denial. He argued that when the ego, too much to the superego, that inner agency representing norms, duties, and social expectations, the person becomes ill. Excessive sacrifices, when unacknowledged and unrewarded, turn into resentment. And it's this hidden resentment that begins to manifest strongly as a woman ages. Many women live decades devoted to others. They diligently cared for children, placing the family's well-being above their own. They took on emotional, practical, and effective responsibilities. They endured daily disappointments, believing they would someday be appreciated for it. But time passed, and instead of recognition, they encountered expectation. What was once a generous gesture became an obligation. What was self-giving became a demand. The husband, in many cases, doesn't notice this process. Accustomed to care, attention, and understanding, he expects everything to remain the same. But the woman is no longer the same. What she once did naturally now burdens her. the food she cooks without pleasure, the silence she maintains without strength, the patience she pretends to preserve. All this points to a deep fatigue that's no longer physical but emotional. She is angry not only at her husband, she is angry at having lost herself, at having lived for others, at having learned to care but never learned to be cared for. This imbalance, accumulated over decades, takes its toll. Love calls not because she didn't love, but because she exhausted inner reserves that weren't replenished. Psychoanalysis shows us that love, like any instinct, must circulate. When constantly directed outward and never returned, it dries up. In this situation, the husband becomes a symbol of everything she gave without return. Every meal served, every sleepless night, every time she stayed silent to keep the peace, all this is embodied in his figure. And without rational understanding, she begins to avoid him, avoids touch, conversation, presence, not out of contempt, but because being near him is like constantly reminding herself how much she diminished herself. Freud said repression turns into a symptom. Constant self-denial, when unexpressed in words, returns as malaise, irritability, apathy. The woman begins to distance herself from her husband not for lack of love, but because she can no longer play the same role. She wants something else, to be heard, held, cared for. But she doesn't know how to ask, because she spent her life learning to give, not receive. This desire to be loved is legitimate, but it's muffled by years of habit. She's used to being the pillar who solves everything, anticipates needs. And when she finally has time for herself, she doesn't know how to occupy this space. The husband, persisting with the same expectations, intensifies the feeling of confinement, and she begins to wonder, where am I in all this? Often, the erosion of bonds arises from this mismatch. While she wants rest, he asks for continuation. While she seeks novelty, he repeats. And the connection tears from within, even if outwardly everything seems unchanged. Freud saw in this a conflict between unconscious desire and the ego ideal. The woman wants freedom, but feels guilty, wants change, but fears emptiness, wants to be cared for, but wasn't taught to receive without giving in return. In this labyrinth, many relationships are lost, not for lack of love, but for lack of reciprocity. It's not an inability to love that depletes, but the entrance to keep giving while receiving nothing back. And the woman, tired, begins to withdraw not as punishment, but as an attempt at emotional survival. And perhaps for the first time, she wants to be seen not as a mother, housekeeper, or caretaker, but as a person with desires, boundaries, body and soul, and above all with the right to stop, not be strong all the time, simply exist without owing anyone anything. Freud asserted that emotional repression can manifest not only in visible symptoms, but also in silence. What goes unsaid, suppressed, or ignored continues to act subconsciously. Many men were taught from an early age to speak of feelings, to silence pain, restrain fragility, hide vulnerability. They were raised to be strong, rational, practical, and as a result, they became emotionally detached. At the start of a relationship, this absence can be masked by passion, urgent obligations, building a shared life. The woman often tolerates the partner's emotional silence, believing he's just shy, introverted, or distracted. But over the years, this absence becomes unbearable. When children leave home and the noise of daily life subsides, what remains is the essential, two adults facing each other. And it's then that the void is revealed. The aging woman wants more than just someone's physical presence beside her. She wants to be heard, to share thoughts, anxieties, fears, memories. She wants attention, empathy, genuine connection. But often, she finds a partner who responds monosyllabically, avoids deep conversations, escapes into distractions, TV, phone, silence. This silence gradually erodes the bond, not because she wants grand declarations or daily affirmations, but because not being heard is a subtle way of disappearing. When she speaks and isn't heard, when she expresses feelings and meets indifference, she feels invisible. And no desire can withstand the feeling of non-existence. Freud understood that a person needs recognition to symbolically exist. Being heard is more than courtesy. It's a psychic necessity. True dialogue affirms the other's existence. When it's absent, helplessness sets in. The woman begins to feel lonely within the marriage. And worse, she has no space to name this loneliness. Over time, she stops trying, becomes less talkative, lowers expectations, and marriage turns into a field of silent coexistence where everything functions, but nothing is expressed. Love in this context dies not from an excess of conflict, but from a lack of connection. It's not the touch that calls, but the soul. The husband may not notice what's happening. He thinks everything is fine because there are no fights. He believes that by being physically present, he fulfills his role. But he doesn't understand that emotional absence is as serious as physical absence, perhaps more so because it's invisible, slowly corrosive. And when the woman finally leaves, he doesn't understand why. The woman doesn't want an eloquent orator. She wants a man who will risk saying, "I feel, I don't know, I need you." She wants to be heard without judgment, to be accepted. And often, she doesn't find this even after decades together, because he was never taught to open this inner world. Psychoanalysis shows us love needs words. Love cannot exist solely through repetitive gestures. It must be renewed with words. When she speaks and he doesn't respond, she stops speaking. When she tries to talk and he walks away, she stops trying. And in the silence, love dies not suddenly, but like a candle snuffed out for lack of oxygen. This is the moment many women give up, not for lack of love, but from emotional exhaustion. They don't want to be heroines of endurance. They want to be acknowledged as individuals and realize that even after so many years, there's no reciprocity in feeling. It's like reliving a childhood where you weren't heard, where your needs were ignored. Freud didn't romanticize relationships. He knew adult love is fragile, requiring constant psychic work, real presence. And when this doesn't happen, it's not uncommon for one's silence to destroy the other's feeling. The woman then leaves first inwardly, then completely. Contrary to what common sense still claims, female sexuality doesn't disappear over time, it transforms. Freud saw desire as one of the primary manifestations of life energy. Libido, in his view, wasn't confined to the sexual act, but expressed itself in various forms of drive, creativity, imagination, the search for pleasure and connection. And this energy, when suppressed, doesn't vanish. It simply shifts location, awaiting a new form of expression. Many women, reaching 50 or 60, experience what they never did before, the possibility to listen to their bodies without fear, guilt, or rush. It's in this moment they discover an intimate freedom youth didn't allow them. For in youth, female sexuality was often shaped by others' expectations. What pleases the husband, what's expected of a wife, what can't be said or done. But in maturity, when children are grown and social obligations lessen, she feels free to rediscover her own body. However, this rediscovery isn't always accompanied by a partner. Many men haven't kept pace with this evolution. They remain tied to an old idea of sexuality, repetitive, hurried, focused on performance rather than presence. As the woman matures, she no longer wants this. She seeks not just the physical act, but an encounter. She wants lightness, intentional touch, eye contact, sensuality. She wants intimate space where she can express herself sincerely, without needing to play a role. The problem is this new desire often collides with the partner's absence, be it physical, emotional, or cultural. He is no longer available, or never was, and this absence isn't just physical, it's symbolic. He doesn't listen, doesn't touch with presence, doesn't give space to the eroticism now born in a different form. Freud understood sexual repression leaves deep scars. And for many women, a whole life passed under its weight. They were taught to silence desire, to adapt, to pretend. Only in maturity, when the body begins to speak louder than norms, do they allow themselves to truly feel. And when they realize the partner can't or won't follow them, they experience a kind of grief hard to name. It's not grief for something lost, but grief for what never was. They aren't crying over lost pleasure. They mourn the time lived in ignorance, the fact they had a right to this pleasure.
They say goodbye to the illusion that one day they would be truly seen and touched. And it hurts because it is at this moment they discover they were always alone in their bedroom.
This sexual incompatibility, once tolerable, now becomes unbearable. Not because desire has intensified, but because consciousness has awakened. She knows what she deserves, and knowing this, she can no longer accept what she once did. What was once endured with resignation is now experienced with indignation, not against the partner, but against lost time. Some women choose silence. Others seek new forms of pleasure within or outside the relationship. Others simply leave because the realization that their own desire was ignored for so long isn't just sad, it changes life. Freud saw this awakening as part of the individuation process, the moment a person stops living for another and begins living for themselves. In maturity, female sexuality can become more intense, more sensitive, more authentic. But it needs space, attention, freedom. And if she doesn't find this in marriage, she seeks it outside or within, because for the first time, she no longer wants to be silent. Freud said the goal of psychoanalysis isn't to make people happy, but to help them become who they truly are. This process, requiring confrontation with inner truth, is rarely painless. For many women, it begins only in maturity, when external demands lessen, and the world's noise yields to the sound of their own consciousness. When children leave home, grandchildren no longer depend on them directly, obligations ease, and even the presence of death draws closer. A crucial question arises: who am I now that I no longer need to care for anyone? It's a simple but devastating question, because many realize they never knew how to answer it. They were daughters, wives, mothers, caregivers, but never learned to simply be themselves. They lived years playing roles, always for others, always for someone else. And when life's mirror reflects an image they don't recognize, the pain of emptiness sets in. Not the emptiness of loneliness, but the emptiness of absence of self. Looking back, they see a path full of renunciations. She understands she stayed in the relationship but out of desire, but out of fear, habit, or not knowing what to do with freedom. Many marriages based on convenience, the weight of time, or the force of habit begin to crumble at this moment, not from arguments, but because the woman, for the first time, finds the courage to look honestly at herself and admit she no longer wants to live this way. Freud understood this moment as an encounter with the real self, what was always there but suppressed by the demands of the superego, collective morality, family expectations. The woman awakening late to herself often feels no hatred toward her husband. There's no open animosity, only deep fatigue, quiet acknowledgement. He never saw me, and perhaps I never allowed myself to be seen. This acknowledgement comes not with rage, but with grief, slow, tender, painful grief. Grief for what could have been, but wasn't. For love she didn't receive. For attention that was never there. For nights spent alone, though a husband was near. For words swallowed, for desires relinquished, for feelings she pretended not to feel. And simultaneously, an impulse toward restoration is born. There's still time to be oneself. It's at this moment the marriage often dies, not for lack of love, but from an excess of silence, from all that went unsaid, from all that was presented as untrue. The end isn't explosive or theatrical. It happens in small concessions, mutual absence, gazes that no longer meet. And when the woman finally allows herself to break the relationship, she does it not out of rebellion, but for psychic survival. She understands that choosing herself isn't selfishness, it's an act of sanity. That staying in a relationship only out of duty is betraying oneself. That the time left is too precious to waste maintaining what's already dead inside. And that even after 60, 70, or 80, one can begin anew, not necessarily with another partner, but with a new relationship with oneself. This woman, who cared for everyone all her life, finally turns her gaze upon herself. And in this movement, she rediscovers strengths she never knew she had. She learns to say no, set boundaries, seek what makes her happy, and understands that the greatest act of love she can offer the world is to be honest with herself. Freud believed analysis leads a person to the capacity to desire sincerely, and many women in maturity intuitively undergo this transition. They begin to desire differently, speak differently, live differently. And yes, this can mean parting with a marriage that no longer aligns with their inner essence. She doesn't hate her husband, doesn't blame him for everything, but she can no longer pretend it still nourishes her. And it's at this moment a symbolic separation occurs. She parts not only with another person, but with the version of herself that lived to please him. And this rupture, however painful, is also a rebirth. Freud didn't see the end of a bond as a moral or personal failure. He saw in the dissolution of relationships a revelatory process, something that exposes truths previously concealed by conventions, fears, or social expectations. In psychoanalytic terms, a breakup can be the moment a person finally confronts who they have become and what they truly want. It's not a collapse, but a transition, not defeat, but a return to one's own psychic wholeness. Many women, as they age, don't hate their husbands. They don't feel explicit malice or direct resentment. They feel inadequacy, a subtle but irreversible shift. They no longer fit into this type of relationship. They no longer recognize themselves in the role they once so naturally assumed. And this, however painful, isn't selfishness, it's growth. Psychoanalysis shows us emotional bonds remain alive only when they transform alongside the people. For love to survive, it needs renewal. It must accompany emotional maturation, changing desires, shifting priorities. When this doesn't happen, when one side changes and the other remains tied to the old script, relationships crystallize. And all that crystallizes gradually sickens. Yet this sickness often isn't expressed in shouts or quarrels. It happens in silence, in words left unspoken, in touches become automatic, in routine that no longer brings joy. It's in this atmosphere of hidden absence, of stability, many women begin to ask, what if I just stop pretending? It's a courageous question because behind it lies an acknowledgement of truth possibly denied for years. They stayed often out of habit, fear, guilt, not out of desire, intimacy, or genuine love. The awareness comes late, but when it arrives, it can't be ignored. If you are one of these women looking at yourself from the outside and not recognizing yourself, don't blame yourself. You didn't fail, you simply grew. Your consciousness changed. What you accept today isn't the same as what you accepted yesterday. And that's a sign of psychic life, a sign you continue to change even after 50, 70 years. And if psychoanalysis deeply values anything, it's precisely this capacity for change. Guilt, when it appears, is natural, but it needs to be understood as part of the process of symbolic rupture. Freud taught us the strongest bonds are also the most unconscious. Breaking a bond isn't just leaving another person's life. It means freeing oneself from the image that person occupied within you. And that requires time, grief, and courage. What many women experience, breaking a marriage that no longer holds meaning for them, is actually a return to themselves. For the first time, they stop living to please others, maintain appearances, fulfill inherited roles. Finally, they begin to sincerely ask, "What do I want?" This simple question has transformative power because it restores the woman's right to command her own life. And when this right returns, everything changes. How she walks, how she speaks, how she looks in the mirror. It's a quiet but profound rebirth. Of course, not everyone will choose divorce. Some will stay in the marriage, but differently, with new boundaries, new conversations. Others will leave not seeking another love, but seeking themselves. In both cases, it's legitimate, because what matters isn't the decision itself, but the inner state from which it's made. Freud said, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise, and perhaps this is maturity's greatest invitation, to look honestly within and ask, who am I now that I've lived so much? If the answer suggests something must end, don't be afraid. The end of love as it was doesn't mean the end of your capacity to love, let alone the end of your life. In fact, it may be quite the opposite, the start of a phase where you love, for the first time, without losing yourself, where you love yourself first, and on that foundation, build lighter, more mature, more authentic relationships. Because the end of a marriage can be, paradoxically, the beginning of your freedom. If this resonates with you, if you like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to get more reflections like this. That way, you won't miss any new videos. All the best, and see you soon.